Chapter 351 No Other Choice by Hydesgrain. Hell spiders were deemed as extinct and didn't harbor a curse, but the Crimson Death, Hell Spider, as Jason called it, was much stronger with its curse because it distorted the enemy's senses. This curse could even forcefully erupt anger and wrath within its opponents, preventing them to retain a calm mind. However, now that the Crimson Death Hell Spider witnessed how some of its offsprings had been killed, the curse's full might had been unleashed. At least that was how Jason's mana eyes perceived it, and he couldn't help but feel that the fight between the Hell Spider and Wind Affinity Songbird was about to become really ugly. The Songbird was already weakened through the distorted senses and erupting emotions from the curse earlier. Now that the curse was fully unleashed, solely targeting it, the Songbird's combat prowess decreased by a large margin within a moment. It tried to fly at a higher altitude, but that was too difficult to maintain, which would force it to retreat several dozen meters. Both sides wanted to continue their fight, and it seemed like there had already existed a feud between these two, even if Jason was unable to tell if it was just how he felt or if this assumption was really accurate. While the Songbird manifested another few batches of wind blades, the Crimson Death Hell Spider enveloped the sack of eggs with several layers of its cobwebs before it charged forward to draw near the opponent it wanted to kill by any means. It was not difficult to see that the Songbird was weakened, yet it was still determined to defeat the Crimson Death Hell Spider, which led it to come closer to. Unfortunately, its distorted senses were the cause of this, because the level-headed Songbird would have never acted like this in normal circumstances. The poisonous, sticky cobwebs were its nemesis, and they couldn't hit the Songbird properly as long as it maintained a certain distance. Shooting out the crescent wind blades it manifested a moment ago, they inflicted several shallow injuries to the Crimson Death Hell Spider that was out of control after its offsprings had died. The Hell Spider sustained many external injuries while drawing closer, and the Songbird's mind was completely out of control. Both had been weakened to a certain degree, and Jason noticed that they distanced themselves by a few hundred meters, which gave him the opportunity to act. Jason was not a saint, but he hoped that helping the small group that was still alive might give him some benefits. On the other side, he felt bad leaving them like this. He was not familiar with the Mythic Garden too, and others should know much more than he did. As such, it was not impossible to get to know more information from the small group if he was able to bring them away. When the Crimson Death Hell Spider shot a huge net made out of its poisonous sticky threads towards the Songbird before jumping into the sky to full suit, Jason took this opportunity to utilize Artemis manifested wings to dive towards the ground. Averting his angle by a small margin, he landed in the middle of the bloody battlefield where the unconscious group laid. Only the young woman that looked at him previously was barely conscious, but Jason would be astonished if she was able to see or sense anything at all, because her face was paper white without a trace of color left. Taking out a few potions, he forcefully injected them into each member of the small group before he used the compressed black flame to cut the sticky, poisonous thread slowly. After the thread was cut, Jason noticed a different problem. The sticky threads stuck to their clothes. He was unable to loosen them, and burning the whole thread would definitely take too long. As such, Jason mumbled an apology before he took off the young men and women's outer layer of clothes. The group that consisted of 2 young men and 2 women was quickly taken care of, because it was not really difficult to take off the clothes. Once that was done, Jason saw 2 spatial rings and 1 storage device nearby the group. He overlooked the dead youths that laid immediately next to them and picked up the spatial rings and storage device, thinking that they might belong to the half-nacked group in front of him. Putting them inside his pockets, Jason was now facing another issue. How can I carry 4 people at once? Jason thought about summoning Scorpio, but he was too slow, and Artemis could only carry 2 at once, which would leave him 2 more to carry by himself. His speed was already slower than Artemis, and he wanted to have her inside his mana core to evade possible incoming attacks while carrying the others. With that in mind, Jason decided to test something out, as he told Artemis that she should focus on manifesting her talons where his feet were. He did the same, and a moment later, Jason felt that his feet enlarged as pain spread through them. His boots burst open, revealing talons where his feet were previously, which caused him to smile oddly. I never imagined that I would have to do that. It feels weirder than manifesting wings on my back, a stinger at my coccyx, or Scorpio's exoskeleton. Jason assumed that it was like that because he never transformed something about his own body to exchange it with one of his soul bond's body parts. It was interesting, a new sensation and slightly uncomfortable, but there was something else he had to take care of for now. He was not sure how long the Crimson Death Hell Spider would be away. Thus Jason picked up the two women to carry them under his arms while he used his talons to grab the two young men's pants. Under normal circumstances, it wouldn't matter whom he carried with what, but the two girls wore a one-piece leather armor, which made it extremely difficult for Jason to find a spot to grasp with his talons after he had taken off their leather armor. Fortunately, the two men wore different clothes, which allowed Jason to take off their leather armor while still being able to grasp somewhere without injuring them further. Thus, Jason was able to carry one person with each limb as he flew off to look out for a place to tend the small group's wounds. Jason utilized his mana eyes to their full extent, searching for a tranquil place without any strong beasts in the surrounding. Only 10 minutes later Jason landed on a thick branch off a large tree where he put down the 4 poisoned young prodigies. Searching for a good resting spot was easier than he thought, but that was most likely because the massacre in the forest center killed larger groups of unblemished beasts in the surrounding area. Nevertheless, Jason wanted to distance himself from the forest center as far as possible before landing. Taking a deep breath after he laid down everyone on the tree branch that was more than 2 meters thick, Jason dissipated Artemis' talons while he decided to retract her wings to press them on his shoulder blades, thinking that he might need them soon. Before anything else, he took out a few clothes from his spatial ring, which he laid on top of the young women because they were the most likely to scream after waking up. He would also feel weird if he were to be in their situation. Half naked with a masked man that had white wings, standing in front of them. What a nice way to traumatize other people. Sighing deeply, he noticed that the young woman from before was still conscious, which astonished him a little bit as he heard a faint "Thank you." Chapter 352 Dr. Jason by Hydesgrain. Jason was astonished that the young woman was still conscious after the poison spread so far through her body. Under normal circumstances, the supersonic attack from the songbird that was amplified with its wind affinity should have finished her off, but that was obviously not the case. From the looks of it, she was also not the strongest among the group of 4. However, what Jason thought to be extremely weird was how 2 Peak Master ranks and 2 Low Magus ranks could be defeated so easily after he saw them acting so carefully when the massacre began. Did they become too greedy, or was my assumption that they were unaffected by the Bloody Nightmare Flower's fragrance and Crimson Death Hell Spider's curse completely wrong? Jason had no idea, but in the end, it was not important. The young woman's thank you was already enough for him to think that rescuing them was worth it. She knew that he wanted to help them from the beginning when he shot an icicle towards them. In the end, not many would help them in such a dangerous situation, even less someone who was much weaker than they were. It was astonishing to see that Jason was able to establish a fortified soul conjunction, but more shocking was the fact that he remained completely unaffected by everything that happened in the forest center. From the Bloody Nightmare Flowers to the Crimson Death Hell Spider's appearance, whose curse was the reason for the small group's life-threatening situation. Initially, they wanted to pluck Bloody Nightmare Flowers to earn a huge fortune because they were in high demand because their price increased manifold compared to a few years before. This was also the reason for them to be unaffected by the flower's fragrance as they made preparations to counter its effect, only to run straight into one of the strongest beings inside the mythic garden. After the young woman thanked Jason, she finally lost her consciousness, leaving Jason, who was clueless about what to do, alone. The most efficient antidotes I have are purified mid-grade 2 potions. Will that be enough to dissolve the poison within their body? He asked himself unsurely, not knowing whether he could save them for good or if he had to take other measures. Taking the purified antidotes out of his spatial ring, he infused them to the 4 unconscious men and women before he injected a little bit of his mana inside them to increase their mana circulation. If the antidote was potent enough, it would start showing its effect after a short moment. However, if that was not the case, Jason was accelerated the poison's spreading speed right now. Weirdly enough, the antidote seemed to be as potent as the poison was, creating a balanced state. As such, the situation didn't become better or worse. It was just stagnating. Unfortunately, the poison had already spread through the young prodigy's whole body, which meant that he was too late if he couldn't find another way to help them. Jason didn't have a stronger antidote left, and there was only one method that might help them, which was however something he had never tested out before. I can insert the Black Origin forcefully in their body and cleanse the body from the poison. It should be possible, I think, maybe. He had never done something like that and was unsure if other bodies would repulse the Black Origin flame or if it might even worsen the situation. If I don't do anything, they'll die either way. Thinking that he was the only one who could help them, he could only give his best. If that was not enough, there was no hope left for them. It was odd, but Jason felt motivated by this thought, and he squatted down in front of the youth that was the closest to dying. Manifesting the Black Origin flame in his hand, he instructed it, while reminding it to be careful. With his help and the Black Origin flame's accurate control, everything should work out as long as they were careful. At least that was what Jason thought when he inserted the Black Origin carefully inside the youth in front of him. He flinched for a short moment before his whole body relaxed, which caused Jason's eyes to widen in astonishment because he thought that the youth died. However, that was fortunately not the case, and he was still breathing. Weirdly enough, his breathing was also much calmer than before. Is that the soothing effect of my origin flame? Or does it feel good to have something warm within him right now? There were too many unknown factors, but there was no time for Jason to ponder about every little detail, which caused him to take a deep breath. Focusing with his mana eyes on the youth's body, Jason was able to see many areas with unstable mana fluctuations and writhing mana, which had a high possibility to stem from the poison inside the youth. As such, Jason lit the Black Origin flame, whose temperature was extremely low, through the youth's body while paying attention that nothing changed for the worse. Everywhere the Black Origin flame passed through, Jason could see an infinitesimal amount of green liquid pouring out of his pores that had been forcefully opened. Intertwined with the green liquid, the youth's body extracted an infinitesimal amount of impurities, which astonished Jason for a short moment before he focused on his main task again. Less than 10 minutes later, he was already done, and the youth's skin was filled with a paper-thin layer of green liquid that had tiny traces of impurities within. Jason was interested in the impurities which the Black Origin expelled from the youth's body, but he had to tend 3 more poisoned patients. 40 minutes later, Jason slumped on the ground and thick sweat pearls poured down his back that was already completely drenched in sweat. Finally done. He could only think as he stared at the group of 4 that looked relaxed and at ease. They were still unconscious, but that was probably because they had to recuperate from the exhaustion caused by the poison's damages. It could also originate from their burst eardrums, which were however not something Jason was able to tend with his capabilities. He did everything he could, and there was nothing else for him to do. During his treatment, Jason noticed 2 things that he found interesting too. The first one was that his Black Origin flame was apparently able to cleanse purities from others than himself. Even if the effect was negligible, Jason was sure that it would be useful in the future. Maybe this ability will become stronger after the Black Origin flame evolves into a Tier 1 Origin flame. Jason was already expecting to learn more about his third soul bond, and maybe he wouldn't have to rely on Dahlia to cleanse his soul bond's body from purities to increase their potential anymore. This was an uncertain factor, and Jason asked himself once again how such a precious origin flame landed on Asterix inside the Goblin King's hideout. There are still too many things I don't understand. While he was deep in thoughts, more than half an hour passed, until the young youth he tended first woke up, exhausted and with drowsy eyes. However, When he turned around, he suddenly noticed that his female companions were half naked, which washed away his drowsiness in a single moment. Chapter 353 Favor by Hydesgrain. Jason noticed that the youth regained his consciousness and looked at him to see if the poison inflicted any severe injuries or if the Black Origin flame expelled the poison before something serious could happen. The latter seemed to be the case, and Jason smiled faintly towards the youngest member of the small group he rescued. He seemed to be energetic when he sat up a few moments after waking up when he saw that the two women in his group were half naked. However, before he could do anything, he saw Jason wearing a mask that covered his face and white wings spreading from his back. As such, the youth couldn't help but hesitate for a moment. Nevertheless, he was worried about his colleagues and tried to shout out loud. "What did you do to them?" Unfortunately, the youth didn't notice that he had no energy left within him, which turned the loud shout into a quiet exclamation. It was not a surprise to feel weird about the sudden situation, in which the small group of 4 young prodigies was currently. They escaped death without knowing how because they were unconscious, only to wake up in front of a masked, winged man, and all of them were half naked at that. "I carried all of you away from the cursed hell spider when it was distracted, and I tried to expel the poison inside your bodies." Jason's answer was simple, but the youth in front of him didn't expect someone to become a Samaritan inside the Mythic Garden Rift, which was the reason for him to straightforwardly ask, "What do you want from us in return?" At this question, Jason couldn't help but grin faintly. It was not like he wanted to demand anything grand from him, but after thinking about it for a moment, there was something he had to acquire. "The only thing I need is to get to know more about the Mythic Garden. There are so many dangerous beasts which I didn't expect to see here. Furthermore, most of them are cursed beings. As such, acquiring information has the most value for me right now." The youth was still suspicious about the masked man, but upon looking down at himself and at the others, he could tell that Jason dispelled the poison within them because a thin layer of inactive poisonous liquid and faint traces of impurities pressed on their body. In the end, it was difficult to carry 4 bodies at the same time, while it should have been even harder to expel the poison within them. As such, the youth lowered his guard as he was about to give Jason what he wanted when the remaining members of his group woke up. Jason decided to take a few steps back to let them talk with each other while observing them in order to see if there was anything wrong with them and how much strength they had left, to see if he could separate from them again. Before that, Jason tried to figure out to whom the spatial rings and the storage device he picked up belonged, only to see that everyone in the group was still wearing their spatial rings and quantum bracelets. Upon seeing this, Jason couldn't help but feel weird. Did I just accidentally steal something from the dead? This wasn't something uncommon, but not exactly what Jason wanted to do when he rescued the group of 4. Scratching the back of his head, Jason couldn't help but smile weirdly, covered behind his mask, thinking that he would take the content of the spatial rings and storage device. It might have been an accident, but they don't need the stuff within anymore because they're dead. As such, I can use them. Jason also pondered whether he should return to the forest center to pick up the remaining spatial rings and storage devices. However, in the end, he decided against it because it was too dangerous. He couldn't be sure when the Crimson Death Hell Spider would return, which would be fatal. Staring at the group of 4 in front of him, he couldn't help but think that they were way too relaxed after escaping death by a hairbreadth. Shaking his head, Jason decided that it would be time for him to depart after knowing that they were fine. "Sorry to disturb this reunion, but if there is nothing else, I'll depart." The 4 team members turned around at once. Only now did the youth remember that Jason was still there, as he quickly said, "I still haven't answered your question. We don't know much about the Mythic Garden because we were sent by our families to this place without getting to know everything. It's obvious that we were supposed to make ties with the Jewel family, but I think everyone sent here has the same task. The only thing we could prepare for was to gather bloody nightmare flowers. Other than that, we received enough information about one place with a few blessed beasts. I don't think it would be too much to ask for if you want to know the place with blessed beasts as thanks for rescuing us." While the other young man and the older young woman looked at him in suspicion because they didn't know what happened after they lost consciousness, the younger woman who was conscious for the longest time was relaxed when she approved the other youth's proposal. In the end, everyone accepted it, but what Jason said next baffled them a little bit. "Rather than a place with blessed beasts, I would love to find a place with many cursed beasts, like a lot." Jason understood the reason for most clans to send their prodigies to the Mythic Garden, and it was not only to make ties with the Jewel clan. These clans and larger families wanted the descendants to bind a blessed beast and apparently also to pluck bloody nightmare flowers that seemed to have a greater value than he expected them to have. If prodigies from larger families and clans were asked to pluck flowers, their worth has to be enormous, but they're only grade 2 ingredients and I can't think of an extremely expensive potion one can concoct out of bloody nightmare flowers. This was definitely weird because Jason was sure that his knowledge about the basic lifestyle occupation was wide and firm. As such, he couldn't help but feel a doubt arising when he heard that the small group of young prodigies that stood in front of him was asked to pluck the nightmare flowers that weren't even worth close to 1-star note. The young men and women were astonished about Jason's demand. It was weird to ask for the location with many cursed beasts, which caused him to remain silent for a moment when the young woman that had stared at him the whole time said, "There is a place I was told to avoid because there are too many cursed beasts, but there are also extremely strong beasts among them, so I recommend avoiding this area too." She explained where he had to go, or rather where he shouldn't venture into. Yet, Jason couldn't help but feel happy because the place the young woman guided him to seemed to be a reclusive area. This would make things much easier for him because there wouldn't be many other young prodigies. Jason was about to depart when he noticed that they were at a high altitude as he asked, "You guys don't need my help to descend to the ground, right?" Hearing this question, the young women who put on a new set of clothes after they washed away the thin layer of poison and impurities couldn't help but chuckle as the older one said, "We don't need a babysitter. You just found us at a bad timing." Nodding his head, Jason spread his wings when he suddenly asked, "How much are the bloody nightmare flowers even worth, if your families and clans requested you to pluck them?" "I thought they were not even worth 500,000 credits. The oldest young men who heard this couldn't help but sigh. "If they were only worth 500,000 credits, we wouldn't even take a single step closer to the center of the forest than necessary. That price is already old. It hasn't been that long, but the demand for bloody nightmare flowers increased manifold, and each flower is worth several million credits according to their quality." This was astonishing and somehow not surprising to Jason, who assumed something. After he heard the young man's answer, Jason nodded his head and thanked them before wishing him a fruitful remaining time within the Mythic Garden before he jumped down the tree branch to depart. Chapter 354 Poor Deceased by Hydesgrain. Diving down the tree, Jason opened his white wings slowly in order to change his trajectory slightly without decelerating too much. Flying through the gigantic forest, with his mana eyes fully utilized, he couldn't help but think that everything within the Mythic Garden seemed to be expensive. Every tree he had perceived released dense mana fluctuations, while some of them started to release a faint color, telling Jason that they were valuable. While this color indicated a living being's potential, it seemed to show the quality of inanimate things. At least that was what Jason comprehended from looking at the difference between all kinds of inanimate objects, materials, and trees. This assumption had turned more logical after he started to concoct and forge, because everything perfectly purified released a faint color if the raw material didn't release a color. Jason couldn't think of a different answer, and even if it was wrong, his current comprehension was enough to understand that objects with denser, or stronger colors were, in most cases, more valuable. However, that was not important for now, because there were other things he had to do instead of cutting trees or something similar to that. There were still 2 spatial rings and 1 storage device in his pockets with content inside which he wanted to transfer to his own spatial ring. Other than that, Jason pondered whether he should search for the reclusive place with cursed beasts, right off the bat, or if it was better to wait until the Black Origin Flame finished constructing its mana core. He was not even sure if the Black Origin Flame would evolve into a Tier 1 Origin Flame immediately after the mana core was established, because it was always demanding to devour other Origin Flames. This could mean that the Black Origin Flame would have to devour another Origin Flame before it was able to evolve. If that were to be the case, his whole plan would be trampled upon. Jason could only hope that the Black Origin Flame was a little bit more considerate towards him. He didn't even know where he should start to search if he needed an Origin Flame to nurture the Black Origin Flame. Fortunately, the chances that the first evolution required another Origin Flame to be initiated were extremely small, and Jason betted that it was not required. As such, he decided to wait until the Black Origin Flame finished constructing its mana core, before it would hopefully evolve, which would allow Jason to receive his second baptism. After his second baptism, Jason would become much stronger than before, and the reclusive area with cursed beasts wouldn't be as dangerous as it currently was to him. With that in mind, he wanted to find a good and secure place in which he could stay for the next few weeks. If his assumption was right, it would take around 2 weeks before the Black Origin Flame's mana core would be completed. At the same time, Jason's mana core would enter the 5th expert rank too. This was something he wanted to reach before his mana core size would be enlarged through the baptism he'll receive once the Black Origin Flame evolved. Several hours passed and Jason's mood plummeted because he couldn't find a single area without strong cursed beings around. He encountered a few blessed beasts, and their strength had been more terrifying than he had expected. Somehow, to Jason, a blessing was similar to the superiority of dragons and equal mythic beasts. The blessing they received allowed them to become much stronger than most other beasts with the same mana core rank. The stronger the blessing they received was, the more powerful they would become, and it was not exaggerated to say that some blessed beings might be stronger than an earth dragon at the same rank. Now that he searched for a secured place for several hours, Jason couldn't help but think of a different solution. He was at the outskirts of the gigantic forest right next to a large mountain range when a sudden idea formed in his head. If I can't find a good hiding spot, I'll make my own. With that in mind, he dived down before landing in front of a large tree where he summoned Scorpio. After that, Jason took a reinforced shovel out of his spatial ring before he started to dig a small hole behind a green bush that released a fragrant smell. The bush was right next to the tree and hid the hole he was digging right now. Scorpio helped him digging, and it didn't take long before a small hole was made. After that, he started to dig until he reached a position extremely close to the gigantic tree's center where he could absorb its radiating mana, which was exactly what he wanted. However, he was still not done, because he told Scorpio to dig another entrance which he could use as a means to escape if a beast or someone else were to find his self-made hiding spot. The tree he picked out was perfect because it had many small and larger bushes close to it, which made it possible for Jason and Scorpio to create a small burrow with 2 entrances. Both were well hidden, and Jason was confident that larger beasts were unable to enter it while smaller beasts were in most cases weaker. There were many exceptions, but it was not his intention to prevent everything from entering the place either way. Jason's plan was to absorb mana for the next few weeks and depart afterwards. There was no need to live in the small burrow he dug with Scorpio. After everything was done, Scorpio entered Jason's soul world once again, and Artemis left his mana core too. Now that he was done with everything, the first thing that had to be done was to check out the 2 spatial rings and the storage device that were still in his pockets. Everyone with a spatial ring should have a certain amount of wealth in it, otherwise, Jason wouldn't know why they even owned a spatial ring, which caused him to pick up the storage device as his first target to check through. As expected, the registered mana fluctuations inside the storage device diminished, and Jason was able to access it with his own mana fluctuations. Upon taking a closer look inside the storage device, he couldn't help but feel that his masters were extremely generous to him. Was this person's family poor? Jason asked inwardly, confused why there was nothing really valuable except a mana grade 2 weapon, lots of mana stones, and miscellaneous items. The number of mana stones was decent, but it was not really something praiseworthy for Jason, who began to notice that he had become greedy after his masters increased their support in nurturing him. However, Jason was sure that he could accumulate the resources within the storage device within a single month even without his master's help. He would have to rely on his lifestyle occupation skills, but that was exactly what he was supposed to do. Transferring everything into his spatial ring, he threw the empty storage device in the corner of the burrow before he looked at the 2 spatial rings, hoping that the loot was better. Instead of wasting more time, Jason accessed both at the same time and transferred the mana stones and everything else that was uninteresting to him inside his spatial ring. Other than a few miscellaneous items, cultivation resources, and weapons that were cleared out of the spatial rings, there was only one book left in one of the spatial rings which attracted Jason's interest. It was not common to see physical books in this era, and Jason took it out of the spatial ring before he laid the 2 empty spatial rings aside. A handwritten book about the Mythic Garden. Jason exclaimed, confused and happy at the same time as he opened it without any hesitation. Chapter 355, Most Terrifying Beasts by Hydesgrain. He didn't think that he would obtain a handwritten book about the Mythic Garden, just like that. It was not as if he did anything to gain it, and one could say that the book was thrown towards him. Jason thought that it was weird to have a handwritten book about the Mythic Garden. However, it was even weirder that the owner of this book had died in the gigantic forest center, as if he didn't know about its dangers. Reading through the first few pages of the book, Jason could immediately tell that the book was the real deal, which caused him to become even more suspicious about the dead owner's behavior. The gigantic forest is known as the Forest of Slaughter, Takra, and everything written inside the first few pages clearly show its dangers. In that case, why the hell did the owner of this book die? Did he receive it from his clan or family just before he departed, or was this person too confident about her abilities which caused him or her to disregard reading the book? Jason knew that he wouldn't be able to figure out the answer, and it was not as if it mattered to him. He just felt that the book was not used properly, which Jason decided to change. Thanks for giving me such a treasure, he thought inwardly, thanking the dead person for gifting him something so precious. Reading through the thick book, several hours had passed before Jason realized as a loud howling resounded through the Takra, the Forest of Slaughter. Could that have been the demonic 3-eyed wolf? He asked himself, as he turned a few pages back, where the image of a pitch-black wolf with 3 eyes was drawn. Its third eye was horizontal and had tiny purple lines similar to runes around it, which could kill someone within a moment as long as the demonic 3-eyed wolf injected enough mana into it. It was unable to kill someone at the same rank or above, but it was still possible to inflict a lot of internal pain, or even cripple someone's tendons, burst open eyes, or inflict other, severe injuries to its opponent. The book about the Mythic Garden was filled with all kinds of beasts one should avoid or contract as soulbond if possible. Everything written within the book was extremely interesting to Jason, who didn't know anything about the beasts inside the Mythic Garden. As such, he gained lots of information in a short time thanks to the handwritten book, which he completely read through after another several hours had passed. He skipped most blessed beasts that were labeled as beneficial to bind, because he was not searching for a blessed beast as his soulbond. Instead, he was more interested in the label, experimental to bind with might be advantageous, which told Jason that there were already a few people that tried to bind cursed beasts like his master, only that Shane bound a pseudo-cursed beast. Apparently, there were only 2 outcomes one could receive after binding a cursed beast. Either one would be weakened to a certain degree but able to curse others with the inherited curse one would receive, or one would receive a strengthened curse without being able to curse others with it. In the former outcome, one could be called a cursed being oneself because one was able to direct curses at others intentionally, as the Crimson Death Hell Spider or the Cursed Panther could do. Meanwhile, the latter was extremely bad in most cases and would result in a major decrease in one's combat prowess. Even killing one's cursed soulbond was not helpful anymore because one would not only harbor the curse but it would have spread through one's whole body. When Jason read that, he was once again reassured that he couldn't take his mission lightly. He had to find a perfect soulbond or he would have to live with the consequences. The handwritten book about the Mythic Garden had many cursed beasts and sentient plants inside it. Additionally, it had a list of the most terrifying ranked beings that habitated the Mythic Garden to which the demonic three-eyed wolf belonged to. Its strength was above a common guardian ranked beast even though it was only at the peak magical rank. And that was without using its third eye. Other than the demonic three-eyed wolf, there were other cursed beasts like the dark satyr, boneflame centipede, deathbed flower, and a petrification serpent. All of them had their own peculiar curses that made them stronger than they already were, but the petrification serpent seemed to be the most feared and at the same time searched beast for young prodigies. While other cursed beasts' curses were extremely powerful and feared by everyone, the petrification serpent seemed to be slightly different. It was said that the petrification serpent harbored two curses at once. One curse was that it could create a temporary weakening effect on other beings that could vary between 5% minus 30%. This was already shocking, but worse was that the weakening effect was worse on humans. Apparently, this curse was very versatile and nobody knew exactly how it worked, which was extremely bad considering that one would fight against a beast that might reduce your strength by a quarter. If that was all, the petrification serpent wouldn't have been considered as an extremely annoying opponent. However, the second curse was the petrification curse, as the serpent's name indicated. It could petrify opponents that were at a lower rank than it was, while foes at the same rank would start to petrify as long as the petrification serpent utilized enough mana to overwhelm the natural resistance of its foes. Higher-ranked foes wouldn't be petrified, but they would have small problems moving around because their condition would be similar to being paralyzed to a certain extent. Combining these two curses, the petrification serpent was extremely powerful. If one were to be at a higher rank than the petrification serpent, the weakening curse could change this, while the petrification curse might be enough to finish a higher-ranked opponent before it was able to attack. Jason could also understand why everyone wanted such a beast as a soulbond. It was relatively simple. If one were able to harbor both curses in one's body while being able to release them at other opponents, one might be able to fight the same way as the petrification serpent. Sometimes one might not even have to move to come out of a fight victorious. However, even if this would have been perfect, it was a fact that the petrification serpent was considered to be within the top 3 of the strongest beasts that inhabited the Mythic Garden. Its mana core rank might only be at the peak magical rank, which seems to be the highest beast rank within the Mythic Garden. However, the petrification serpent was a physically oriented beast. One could say that the petrification serpent was able to defeat all peak magical ranked beasts solely with its body. Jason didn't even doubt that it was able to defeat guardian ranked beasts only through its physical strength too. At least that was according to a few certain tales the handwritten book told about the petrification serpent. Reading the tales about the petrification serpent being able to fight 4 of the most terrifying beasts inside the Mythic Garden at once were frightening, but Jason felt like he wanted to see how it looked like. The Crimson Death Hell Spider was already considered an extremely strong beast within the Mythic Garden, but it was still weaker than the most powerful beings in the book's ranking. This clearly showed how terrifying the strongest beasts were. Weirdly enough, Jason noticed that the top 10 of the most terrifying beasts were perfectly balanced with 5 blessed beings and 5 cursed beings. That shouldn't be right, it's probably forged, but whatever. The names of some blessed beings sounded ridiculous and he doubted that they belonged in the most terrifying ranking. Silver-eyed rabbit and Millennium cotton sheep didn't really sound like terrifying beasts, but the tales Jason read about them were completely different. Choked by cotton. Bewitched by eyes and suicided. Other than that, Jason figured out that the silver-eyed rabbit seemed to harbor a blessing which allowed it to foretell the future to a certain extent. That was in addition to its affinity, which made it extremely strong and also popular for everyone who searched for a powerful, blessed beast as Soulbond. However, Jason knew that nobody would be able to get their hands on such a beast under with mankind's current capabilities. Chapter 356 Complete Mana Core by Hydesgrain. Catching one of the most terrifying ranked beasts within the Mythic Garden was not easy, at least not as long as the Rift's age restriction acted as a limiter for one's cultivation rank. Humanity's prodigies at and below the age of 20 could at the most break into the Magus rank or the starting line of the League stage. After liquefying their mana, everyone's progress would differentiate, but most prodigies would take more than 2 decades to enter the Grand Magus rank. However, even if one were to reach the Grand Magus rank at the age of 20, Jason doubted that he or she would be powerful enough to catch the silver-eyed rabbit or any beast of that caliber. That was because they were no ordinary beasts and simply too strong. Shaking his head, Jason could tell that the list about the most terrifying beasts was just a warning and not something one could consider catching. Meanwhile, the important information about possible soulbonds was about other beasts at the unblemished and low magical rank. Their blessings and curses were weaker than the ones from the most terrifying ranked beasts, but that was not surprising to Jason, who had already begun to comprehend how exactly the Mythic Garden was constructed. According to what he understood, the strongest beasts were overlords from certain areas while the weaker beasts could be considered their underlings. There were probably also zones between the territory of 2 overlords that would be counted as barriers where other strong beasts, like the Crimson Death Hell Spider and Wind Elemental Songbird, lived. Jason was not sure if that was the case, but he assumed it to be because the handwritten book about the Mythic Garden hinted that his thought was correct. That was also the reason why the book warned of all overlord beasts, because one of them could be in every area one might enter. As such, it was better to know all beasts in order to prevent acting in certain ways to attract the attention of some of the stronger beasts. All of that made it more difficult for Jason and every other human to catch and contract a new soulbond, because some beasts that cried in despair when they were caught could ignite some beasts' wrath, even if they might be each other's prey or even predator. Mankind never understood a few things about beasts, and one thing was that beasts hated being bound to someone else. This might even cause that the greatest arch-enemies to help each other and to defeat the human who wanted to bind one of them. Jason could tell that almost every beast hated to be restricted in their freedom, which was something he understood too. He felt also apologetic to his soulbonds that he couldn't provide a better soul world with his current capabilities because he was unable to customize his soul world as of now. Only after he reached a higher amount of soul energy would he be able to customize everything to a certain degree, but until he was able to do so, time would pass. Most humans didn't care about customizing their soul world because they found it useless, but soulbonds would feel more comfortable within the soul world after it was customized. As such, Jason understood how these beasts might feel, even if it made everything harder for him and other humans. On the other hand, Jason had already imagined how he would feel if he were to find a perfectly suitable soulbond, but then, suddenly, right before he was about to bind it, a small horde of beasts or even one of the overlord was to appear in front of him. How devastating would that be? Jason didn't even want to imagine it, and he just shook his head. The petrification serpent's weakening effect seems interesting, but even if it would be suitable for me to bind, how would I bind one of the strongest, cursed peak magical ranked beasts? Smiling lightly, Jason decided that it was more important for him to focus on transferring mana to the Black Origin Flame so that it could finish constructing its mana core. As such, he closed the handwritten book about the Mythic Garden, which he already finished reading through once before he decided to focus on his own mana absorption. Taking out a few mana stones in addition to accelerating everything, Jason closed his eyes before loosening mana threads from every mana stone in his surroundings before he inserted them into his body. More than 2 weeks had passed in the blink of an eye, and Jason's mana core broke through as it reached the 5th expert rank. This was as expected and not surprising, and Jason didn't pay much attention to his breakthrough. That was because shortly after that the Black Origin Flame had notified him that it was about to finish constructing the mana core within it. However, What surprised him was that the Black Origin Flame's thoughts were not only much clearer than before but also that he sensed its joy and fear at the same time. Is constructing a mana core something to be afraid of? Jason asked inwardly, and after asking his soul bonds, he figured out that he forgot something extremely important which he already knew long before. Every beast with a completed mana core was able to reach the magical rank, but one couldn't reach the magical rank in complete mana core. As such, it was something essential to be qualified to liquefy one's mana. This itself was not something to be afraid of, but what came with this information was different. Is the Black Origin Flame even able to absorb its own mana, and how does it liquefy the gaseous mana it absorbs? It doesn't have the required organs, or does it? Jason was suddenly wondering how elementals, which seemed to be similar to the sentient Origin Flame, were liquefying their mana. The only plausible solution was that their mana core was special, which led him to inquire how his Black Origin Flame was thinking of doing something similar. Its answer made Jason happy and afraid at the same time, which was exactly how the Black Origin was feeling. In the end, this was completely understandable. The Black Origin had informed him that it would evolve into a Tier 1 flame, which was joyous news. This evolution would fuse the mana core it had created with the Black Origin Flame and transform the mana core, which made it possible for it to liquefy mana to drops. Initially, Jason thought that this was extremely good news, but after the Black Origin Flame had informed him that it had to feel pain for the first time in its life, Jason's mood soured. For someone who had never felt pain, it would definitely be extremely painful even if one would just prick one's finger with a needle. As such, Jason decided that he would transfer the majority of its pain to himself, which was possible thanks to the fortified soul conjunction they established. However, worse was that the Black Origin Flame seemed to think that the pain it had to endure would be extremely painful. Jason could only frown when he heard that. As if that was not enough, he knew that he would receive his baptism immediately after the Black Origin Flame would evolve into a Tier 1 Origin Flame. This meant that he would have no time to rest, and if his estimation was right, the next few days might be extremely painful and exhausting. After he saw that the Black Origin Flame's mana core was completed, Jason took a deep breath. I guess the torture can begin now. Chapter 357, Life on the Line by Hydesgrain. It was unknown as to what had happened, but Jason didn't even remember how exactly the Black Origin Flame had evolved into a Tier 1 Black Origin Flame. After he had accepted its pain that was stronger than he had expected, Artemis and Scorpio had utilized their own fortified soul conjunction which they had with him to take the pain he had transferred from the Black Origin Flame to himself. Once that happened, the pain he felt lightened, but at the same time Jason could feel that something about the Black Origin Flame began to change as his sight blurred. What happened after that was unknown and he was unable to remember much. Time seemed to pass slowly, and when he had regained his senses, the Black Origin Flame had completed the fusion with the mana core. At the same time the fusion happened, the Black Origin Flame's mana core changed slightly, which allowed it to liquefy mana to drops. However, what happened afterward shocked Jason greatly. The moment he regained his senses, huge pain overflowed his body because the baptism had already begun. Jason was glad that nothing went wrong with the evolution of the Black Origin Flame, but he would have loved to witness everything. It was obvious that Jason had underestimated the potency of the Black Origin Flame, which caused the current pain he had to endure. The Black Origin Flame that was currently cleansing everything inside Jason's body wanted to slow down, however, Jason ordered it to continue without holding back. Meanwhile, Artemis and Scorpio tried to transfer Jason's pain to them to share and lessen the pain he had to endure. Astonishing enough, sharing the pain during the baptism seemed to be impossible, which would have shocked Jason if he was able to think clearly. However, that was not possible because of the pain that spread throughout his whole body, igniting his mana veins, arteries, blood cells, bones, skin, and mana core. Everything within Jason was burning, and he was sure that the pain he was enduring right now was equal if not worse to the time he refined his mind. The pain caused by the devilish Valkyrie shield fruit was already terrifying, but the second baptism he was undergoing felt even worse. Jason's pores opened and a terrible reeking black mass of impurities oozed out of them, but that was not important to Jason right now. He was only trying to endure the pain and prevent crying out once again because he could already feel that he attracted the attention of other beasts, which was not something he wanted to do. Jason was defenseless and he would be the first to die if anything were to approach him, and he could only rely on Artemis and Scorpio if something were to happen. However, Jason hoped that his soul bonds wouldn't have to protect him. More than 2 days had already passed and the baptism was still not complete. The whole ground was littered with bad reeking impurities, and if Shane or Dahlia were to see the sheer mass of impurities, they would be shocked and ask if Jason's whole body had been completely purified from impurities. This was not the case, and one could only wonder how many impurities the human body had within in order to release enough impurities to fill the whole burrow Jason sat inside. After 2 days, Jason didn't feel as overwhelmed by the pain he had to endure as in the beginning, which didn't mean that it was not extremely painful. If he were to be even a little bit less strong-willed, it was unknown what would have happened to his sanity. Fortunately enough, this was not something Jason had to be afraid of, and he was already able to smile brightly while enduring the consistent pain which the Black Origin flame unleashed when he noticed that the baptism was refining his mana veins throughout. After his whole physique had been cleansed, strengthened, and refined, the Black Origin flame began to cleanse Jason's mana core, which the baptism forcefully enlarged. This worried Jason a little bit, but after his own and Dahlia's assumption that a baptism was different than a soul world amplification was proven correctly, Jason couldn't help but feel relieved because his vessel was enlarging before it would be strengthened. He didn't have to be afraid of his vessel breaking after receiving the baptism, which was a large stride forwards. Nevertheless, Jason knew that his baptism was still not over, even if he was already at the last few steps that were about refining his mana veins, brain, eyes, and other senses. The last step of the baptism was said to be the one that made everyone feel the most uncomfortable because a single mistake could lead to a devastating disability. However, Jason was not afraid that something like that would happen. He was supposed to endure the pain and nothing else. His trust towards the Black Origin was enough to allow it to take control of the full baptism, which other owners of Origin flames might not allow in fear of sustaining injuries. However, what Jason didn't expect was that roughly 6 hours after the final step of his second baptism was initiated, a large number of putrefaction rats, which was a beast at the low unblemished rank, were to rush towards Jason's position. They had been attracted by the reeking stench of impurities and wanted to devour them, and Jason, who was completely oblivious to the fact that his life was on the line. He was currently gritting his teeth to endure the purification of the mana veins inside his eye. After the mana veins within his eyes would have been purified, his other senses were the last area that had to be purified before the pain he endured over several days would be over. Only a few hours were left and Jason was already expecting to figure out how much stronger he became, when Artemis and Scorpio, who left the Soul World several days ago because they were bored to stay inside the Soul World for too long, informed him about a large horde of putrefaction rats that rushed directly towards his direction. They couldn't tell if the rats targeted him, but there were several thousand of them at once, which was not something they would be able to take on lightly. Nevertheless, it wouldn't be surprising if a handful among several thousand rats were to accidentally fall into the cavern entrances Jason and Scorpio dug, which would most likely result in a bloody mess. As such, without waiting for Jason to respond to her, Artemis used her affinity to forcefully close the cavern entrance by creating a thick layer of ice within it. She left a tiny hole, barely enough to supply Jason with enough oxygen, preventing him from suffocating in the burrow they had dug. Jason knew that something had happened, but he couldn't focus on the transmitted messages from both Artemis and Scorpio because the pain distorted all of his senses. Unfortunately, the Black Origin flame couldn't stop the baptism now, because it would leave behind his eyes half purified, which might result in a huge backlash, injuring them seriously. As such, instead of stopping, they accelerated and the Black Origin flame started to purify all his other senses immediately after Jason gave it the permission to do so. Even if the Black Origin flame didn't do this, purifying and refining his eyes was the task that took the longest. This was also the reason for the Black Origin Flame to start purifying his other senses at the same time, to save time. As such, Jason could only wait until his baptism was completed before he was ready to depart. Fortunately, the putrefaction rats were only at the low unblemished rank, which gave Jason enough hope that his soul bonds would be able to survive if the worst-case scenario were to appear. While Artemis circled above the first sealed entrance, Scorpio retreated a little bit to prevent being run down by the mass of rats. If the putrefaction rats were to act weird, both would immediately act, which was something they hoped to be an unnecessary worry. Unfortunately, this was not the case, and the first putrefaction rats in the stop slowed down at the first sealed cavern entrance to start digging through the ice. Jason noticed the uncomfortable and frustrating emotions from both Artemis and Scorpio as their mana erupted in order to attack the mass of several thousand putrefaction rats. They had to defend Jason, even if they had to sacrifice their lives. Chapter 358 Blind Versus Army by Hydesgrain. Seconds felt like hours, minutes like weeks, and Jason's confidence in Artemis and Scorpio's survival had begun to turn into worry and fear. He couldn't see them because his eyes were shut, as the Black Origin Flame was currently doing its utmost efforts to refine the mana veins in his eyes. Nevertheless, even if he couldn't see anything, Jason perceived everything through the fortified soul conjunction he had established with Artemis and Scorpio. As such, he was able to tell that their fight above the surface was slowly changing for the worse. From overpowering the putrefaction rats with their physical strength and affinity utilization, it began to change into an exhausting slaughter. There were so many putrefaction rats that killing one made enough space for two more to replace the dead brethren. Artemis was not in a problematic spot because she was able to fly above them, killing the rats with tiny icicles that didn't need too much mana to be manifested. Nevertheless, she was forced to enter close combat in order to prevent rats from entering the burrow where Jason was currently located. They had already begun to dig through the thick layer of ice Artemis had manifested above the small entrance, and her small, low mana-consuming icicles had become too inefficient to stop the large mass of rats. As such, she did not only have to enter close combat, but she manifested icicles around her, which she shot towards the rats that were everywhere. Meanwhile, Scorpio was neither in a worse nor better situation than he had been since the beginning. His body was larger and a much easier target to attack for the putrefaction rats, but his poison affinity and mana utilization made it possible for Scorpio to defeat the majority of beasts around him. Unfortunately, Scorpio's mana consumption was much higher than he had expected, and the mass of putrefaction rats seemed to increase further. Almost a whole hour had passed until Jason was unable to take it anymore. Both Artemis and Scorpio's mana cores were completely drained from mana, and their strength decreasing with each second passing. Yet, they still fought with all their might in order to protect Jason. Almost every soft part of Scorpio's body was torn apart, and he was barely staying alive because he thought about the fact that Jason might be ripped apart because of his negligence. Artemis' magnificent and white plumage turned crimson-red from all the blood splattered on her, which was something that had never happened to her. However, she also continued to fight, ignoring the pain spreading through her whole body. Both killed several thousand putrefaction rats in total, and not a single one was able to pass through the cavern entrance to kill Jason, who was unable to move during the last hour. However, that had changed now. The baptism was still not over, and the Black Origin Flame was also not done with his eyes, but Jason felt that he could finally move again. Enduring the pain within his eyes that was also the last body part that had to receive the baptism, he jumped up, while his eyes remained closed. Gritting his teeth, he used his superb senses and mana fluctuations to sense where the entrances were as he rushed up to one of them. Taking out the Viridi Starstream dagger set from his spatial ring, Jason felt that his entire being was churning with wrath towards the putrefaction rats. Circulating mana through his body, he perceived how powerful he had become as he crushed the ice Artemis had manifested to seal the cavern entrance. A reeking stench of iron permeated the air, but Jason couldn't care less as he ordered both Scorpio and Artemis to enter his soul world as soon as possible. They wanted to object to him, fearing that he might die once they left him, but Jason used his soulbond contract to force them to obey his orders. Reluctant, Artemis and Scorpio could only do as Jason ordered as they used their last energy to approach him. Once both reached a certain range around him, they could enter Jason's soul world, which they did. After he felt that they entered his soul world safely, Jason sighed in relief before he turned serious again. I should be at the 7th master rank with Artemis and Scorpio's amplification. That's enough. Before, Jason was unsure whether he was strong enough to fight against the putrefaction rats without using Artemis or Scorpio to enter his mana core, but that was fortunately not necessary. Thankfully, his soul bonds could recuperate much faster inside his soul world, and he wouldn't have to give them any more burden to take on. Jumping out of the cavern entrance, he was immediately greeted by several putrefaction rats, which he felt by using his mana fluctuations to scan his surroundings, which was something he could already do instinctively. He had been blind for the majority of his life. How else would he have survived the dangerous world, without anyone to rely on, if he were to be unable to use his mana fluctuations to sense his surroundings? When his mother was still alive, this was less of a problem, but after she was murdered, Jason had to take care of himself without burdening other people in his surrounding. As such, his mana perception was superior to almost everyone he knew, and being forced to fight blind was not something he feared as he did before, when he was still younger. Now, he was much stronger and not at the bottom of the food chain where he had to use every ounce of mana he gathered to insert it into his eyes in order to awaken them. Jason was confident to fight back, which he showed by piercing out with both Viridi Starstream daggers. Cutting the first putrefaction rats in two halves, Jason used a large margin of mana stored within him to explosively unleash thick, cold mist that enveloped him and a radius of 5 meters a moment later before the mist began to spread further. He could have used a poisonous mist too, but there were 2 reasons why he didn't do so. The first one was that the putrefaction rats had a mild poison resistance, which Scorpio transmitted to him after he had figured that out during the hour he had fought desperately against them. Another factor for Jason to not use the poisonous fog was its immense mana consumption. Using 2 fused affinities at the same time, at a large range, was not something he could handle right now. He was unaware of how many putrefaction rats there were still left in the surrounding area after all. Jason was already confused why so many putrefaction rats tried to enter his self-made burrow, because they were just too many of them to make it look like a coincidence. The impurities I expelled during the baptism might have attracted the putrefaction rats, but that doesn't mean that it was the reason for them to leave their habitat. I guess. There was no reason to think about it for now, but Jason was still full of doubts as he slashed, stabbed, and cleaved towards several dozen putrefaction rats that tried to find him with all their means. After he listened to his soulbond's transmitted thoughts, he was fully aware of how the putrefaction rats acted, and it was only a matter of time before he finished them off. These rats might be at a numerical advantage, but their mana fluctuations were extremely crude, and their control over mana was worse than that of a 10-year-old youth who had begun to sense mana for less than a month. As such, the putrefaction rats were not only considered blind because of the mist, but also unable to sense anything in their surroundings. The only thing they could do was to listen to their surroundings' noises. However, this was also not simple, because Jason kept a few putrefaction rats alive after inflicting deep gashes into their body before he kicked them into all kinds of directions, where they laid on the ground, screaming their last few breaths out. This distracted the putrefaction rats that tried to remain calm could only smell that the cold mist which permeated the whole surrounding area had traces of a decayed iron stench in it, which made them nervous. Jason was confident that he was able to massacre every single putrefaction rat, even with his current condition couldn't be considered perfect. He was blind and had to endure a lot of pain through the baptism that was still continuing. However, Jason was still at an advantage because of his superior combat prowess and experience. More than 10 minutes passed and the number of putrefaction rats diminished at a rapid pace as his speed accelerated further. After being able to see something for several months, it was somewhat uncomfortable to be forced to fight blind. It decreased his combat prowess by a small margin, but he was still powerful after he had undergone the baptism. However, after another long and arduous hour had passed, Jason heard a loud scream amplified by Mana from behind. He was able to sense that the mist in the surrounding area dissipated, which only left a small area filled with mist around Jason behind. His mana fluctuations were unable to perceive anything further than 50 meters, but Jason could tell that something strong had followed the putrefaction rats, which caused Jason to frown deeply. Nothing worked according to his plan, and it was frustrating. "Can't I have my piece, please?" Chapter 359 Baptized Eyes by Hydesgrain. Jason sensed the putrefaction rats' fear from their mana fluctuations, and he could immediately tell that the amplified roar, which probably stemmed from a peak unblemished or magical ranked beats, was an enemy. "If they were pursued, why did the putrefaction rats try to kill me, Artemis and Scorpio? From the bloodthirsty aura, it's obvious that they weren't in a rush. Furthermore, the whole fight against them takes already longer than 2 hours. Did this unknown beast hear our noises that attracted its attention? I'm really out of luck today." The Black Origin flame transmitted him the thought that the baptism would be completed in a few minutes at most. However, this was the only good news, because Jason had to ask himself seriously if he could even survive for that long. His strength was too shallow to fight against a beast that might have already begun to liquefy the mana within its mana core. As such, he could only use everything up to his sleeves to retain a certain distance towards the unknown enemies before he was able to open his eyes again. Releasing a large amount of mist at once, Jason exerted the weightless steps movement technique to retreat quickly while avoiding the putrefaction rats that jumped towards him suicidal. Jason knew the rough direction of the unknown opponent, but that was already everything he knew, which was definitely not much. From the mana fluctuations he perceived from the beast after everything had calmed down, Jason could tell that it was either a newly advanced magical rank beast, also called Lick Stage Beast, or that it was about to liquefy its first drop. Sighing deeply, Jason stored the Viridi Starstream daggers away before grasping one putrefaction rat after another to throw them towards the direction he assumed the unknown opponent to be. Only a moment later, he heard another mana-amplified voice which caused his ears to ache as he used mana to protect him from sustaining any injuries. After that, he had to focus on releasing more mana while retreating further, without caring where exactly he was going. Jason was still able to perceive his surroundings, and as long as putrefaction rats were between him and the unknown opponent that seemed to be aggressive, yet small if he didn't hear wrongly, everything would be fine. 2 minutes had passed and the unknown enemy was still far away from Jason, as he had heard many loud squeaking noises that were amplified by mana. This seemed to be the unknown beast's most used way to attack, which was good to know for Jason. As long as he could protect his ears and avoid the sound waves or whatever the unknown beast attacked with, he would be fine. Rather than wasting his time attacking, Jason wanted to survive and tend his soulbond's wounds. They were already extremely exhausted, and he could feel their pain that was equal to his own, which was not something either of them had wanted to endure. However, what annoyed him the most were the putrefaction rats, because they tried to cling to his leg, bite into it and rip his flesh out. Jason couldn't understand why they weren't trying to run away from the unknown opponent, but it was clear that something was extremely weird. Only a moment later he heard the crunching sounds of breaking bones multiple times from further away. Suddenly he perceived strong mana fluctuations shooting towards him, and Jason could immediately tell that it was the unknown opponent's shockwave attack. He was able to barely evade the attack by twisting his body into an uncomfortable angle. After that, Jason sensed that the beast was about to attack him with its small body when it entered the range of his mana-released mana fluctuations that was a radius of 50 meters. Creating a thick wall of ice in front of him, Jason used the tree behind him to push himself into the air, straight towards the ice wall which he had erected. Using this ice wall, he pushed himself from it again. Lifting his arms, he grasped the tree branch above him before he pulled himself up. Running along the tree branch, he could only hear the unknown beast using several sound waves to attack him. While the first two missed him by a large distance, the third missed him by a hairbreadth. Unfortunately, Jason was not able to avoid the fourth sound wave which hit his back. He was fortunate enough to have enveloped his body with a thick layer of mana which he had drawn out of the Mana Sphere bracelet only a moment before. Crushing into the ground, Jason felt the putrefaction rats jumping on top of him, trying to bite through the mana membrane enveloping him. Shouting out, he released a thick layer of highly corrosive poison that was barely efficient against the putrefaction rats, who jumped back in astonishment. They didn't expect the bipedal being to have the same affinity as the gigantic sapphire blue scorpion. Jason used this moment of astonishment to push himself from the ground as he received the Black Origin Flame's notification that the baptism has been completed. A radiant smile emerged on his face as he ordered the Black Origin Flame to enter his mana core, which it did without hesitation. Black churning flames enveloped Jason within a moment, and he didn't even perceive that a tiny trace of a golden color was intertwined in the black flame as he opened his golden eyes, which were filled with coldness, anger, and the intention to eradicate everyone obstructing his path. "You little F-seekers. I've had enough." This was the only thing he thought as his voice that sounded calm, yet overbearing and cold, resounded through the surrounding area. Die. Jason's killing intent was fully unleashed through his eyes as he supplied them with mana which made them glow faintly. The putrefaction rats, who were about to attack Jason once again, stiffened, and the same seemed to happen to the other putrefaction rats that stared at him in fear. If they were able to, they would flee as far as possible, but they were unable to move a single inch when they sensed an ominous being infiltrating their body and mind. Eternal darkness enveloped them, and the putrefaction rats' eyes turned pitch black without a single trace of white left before they began to attack each other. Suddenly, Jason felt as if he were about to collapse on the ground as the terrifying aura around him vanished in an instant as he noticed what was going on. When he opened his eyes, Jason felt weird, and he couldn't explain what had happened in words. If there were a word to describe everything he felt at that moment, it would probably be almighty. However, that sensation vanished faster than one could even blink with one's eyes, and Jason could only perceive how the putrefaction beasts continued to massacre each other, even after their eyes regained the normal color. Turning around, towards the unknown beast that stared at him in hesitation, not knowing what to do, Jason could only smile lightly as he mumbled. "AF-seeking oversized weasel tried to kill me. You annoyed me long enough." His entire being was filled with wrath, thinking that the gigantic vociferous weasel that was in front of him might have been the reason for the putrefaction rats to attack him, Artemis and Scorpio, which was, however, not the case. Nevertheless, Jason's mind was filled with anger, and he was unable to extinguish it. The simple thought that the low-lick stage beast in front of him might have been the cause for his soulbond's pain made his blood boil. Chapter 360, Might of an Tier 1 Origin Flame by Hydesgrain. Nobody could stop Jason anymore, and even his soulbonds that tried to stop him from doing something stupid remained unheard. Taking out the pseudo-mana grade 2 light longsword from his spatial ring, Jason used a large amount of mana from the Mana Sphere bracelet to insert it into the blade that began to shine brightly. Unleashing his newly evolved Tier 1 Origin Flame, Jason enveloped the light longsword with it, increasing its lethality by another layer. The gigantic vociferous weasel in front of him was still shocked about Jason's eyes, thinking that he was one of the cursed beings it encountered during its life in the Mythic Garden. Pondering whether it should escape or attack Jason, the gigantic vociferous weasel was only able to answer this question when Jason had already pushed his feet from the ground. He exerted the perfect mastery weightless steps technique to accelerate his speed by 60%. While Jason's mana circulation increased by a large margin after his mana veins had been cleansed from most impurities, Jason was confident in accelerating his speed further. Circulating mana through his whole body, his speed and endurance increased, and he appeared before the gigantic vociferous weasel that was about to run away, shocked by Jason's sudden change. However, Jason couldn't care less about what his opponent was trying to do, as his cold, bright golden gleaming eyes caused it to stiffen for a quarter of a second. Jason used this moment to exert the Divus Swordmaster martial art technique as he pierced out with the pseudo-mana grade 2 light longsword that was glowing brightly. The gigantic vociferous weasel wanted to defend itself by attacking Jason with a soundwave. However, what nobody had expected was that the flame enveloping the light longsword burned through the shockwave that was manifested by amplifying the weasel's voice with compressed mana. The Black Origin flame's strength attained that of a low lick stage, and after evolving, it seemed to be easier for it to burn through mana, at least to a certain degree. Deflecting the mana-amplified shockwave, the trajectory of his first attack was averted and Jason drew out more mana from the Mana Sphere bracelet to envelope his body in order to prevent the gigantic vociferous weasel from killing him with a single attack, only to see that it was not attacking him anymore. Not minding that, Jason pierced out with his light longsword once again, straight through the gigantic vociferous weasel's large body that had the size of a large dog. The Black Origin flame drained his remaining mana at a rapid pace, which made him wonder what was going on as his mana eyes perceived that the gigantic vociferous weasel was still trying to fight against its evident end. It enveloped Jason's light longsword with its own mana, the moment the sword pierced into its body to prevent it from penetrating deeper. However, after evolving into a Tier 1 Origin Flame, the Black Origin Flame's ability to negate mana increased manifold, which Jason had already noticed. The amount of mana it demanded also increased. However, every single trace of mana he had to supply was worth the effect he received. This caused him to unleash his remaining mana at once, burning through the gigantic vociferous weasel's thick mana layer around his sword. Just like that, a loud sizzling noise began to resound through Jason's ears. The weasel's whole body began to smoke, and its last tries to change its evident fate resounded through the whole forest as it amplified its pained voice. Only a few moments later, when Jason's mana core was drained from mana, the gigantic vociferous weasel's eyes dimmed before they turned lifeless. Its body went limp and Jason pulled out the light longsword before he slumped to the ground, completely exhausted. The putrefaction rats were dead, killed by each other, and Jason had defeated his first lick stage beast while his mana core size and physique were at the 7th master rank. This was something crazy, but he also knew that it was probably a one-time occurrence, as the gigantic vociferous weasel seemed to have just finished its breakthrough. At least that was what he could perceive through his mana eyes. The drop of mana within the weasel's mana core was infinitesimal, but that didn't mean one could underestimate such an opponent. Fortunately, the Black Origin Flame's capabilities increased by a large margin after it had evolved into a Tier 1 Origin Flame. Not only was the baptism it allowed Jason to receive extremely beneficial, but the Origin Flame's ability to nullify mana increased too. If the Black Origin Flame wanted to, it could pierce through manga-based attacks that were lower than its current strength that was at the beginning of the lick stage. For others, it would be at the magical rank, but Jason decided to take on the revamped cultivation system for himself. He had to face the fact that mankind's cultivation system was not realistic either way. As such, he might as well accept it. Jason was exhausted because had undergone several days of torture, and now that he was completely drained from mana, his tiredness was noticeable. However, he couldn't sleep right now because the noises and massacre he had created had a high probability to attract even stronger beasts. The gigantic vociferous weasel was already more than enough for Jason to handle with great difficulties, and he was unable to fight another strong beast. As such, he used the replenished mana which he received from the passive mana gathering cycle that was established in his sub-area to exert the weightless steps technique after he had stored the gigantic vociferous weasel's carcass away. Running off, Jason searched for a good place to hide for the next few hours, in which he wanted to tend his soulbond's wounds, take a short nap, and cleanse his body from all impurities. The Black Origin Flame, which continued to stay inside his mana core and enveloped his whole body, was flickering joyously. It was even able to cleanse his exhaustion to a minuscule degree. Only then did Jason notice the faint traces of a golden color within the black flames. What is that? Jason didn't know why the black flames had suddenly strands of a golden color within after it had evolution, but there was no time to think about that for now. The highest priority was to find a secure place to take care of Artemis and Scorpio, who seemed to have overcome the most dangerous period. From the look of it, the soul world was a greater means to heal soul bonds than it was said to be. But that was reassuring. However, this didn't mean that he wanted his soul bonds to feel pain. As such, after he had found a relatively good place, without many strong beasts in the surrounding, Jason summoned both Artemis and Scorpio, who jumped towards him without caring about the pain they felt. The Black Origin flame retracted its flames quickly, otherwise, the reunion would have ended with a rather painful memory. After Artemis and Scorpio had calmed down, freeing Jason, he poured a few potions into their mouth, which made him feel better once a few seconds had passed. Not minding their reluctance to part ways again, Jason summoned their magic circles to bring them back to the soul world, where their wounds healed much faster. After that, he took a short glance at the Black Origin flame, which left his mana core to enter his soul world again. "Aren't these golden traces similar to my soul world's color?"